3 men. That is how many SAS soldiers walked out of the forest of Saint-Sauvant near the village of Rome on the afternoon of the 7th of July, 1944. Not through the trees on their own feet. In lorries, under guard. And they did not walk out at all. They were taken to the edge of 3 freshly dug mass graves and executed by firing squad in accordance with an order signed by Adolf Hitler 2 years earlier. They were British soldiers, paratroopers, veterans of 2 years of desert raiding, men who had survived the full width of the North African desert on brackish water and cold rations, men who had broken the Luftwaffe's forward air supply network from the inside and come back to do it again. They were killed in a French wood because the wrong people had made the wrong decisions about how to use them. 34 SAS soldiers died that afternoon. With them died an American pilot, Lieutenant Lincoln Bundy of the United States Army Air Forces, whose plea from the SAS men to the Germans to spare him as a uniformed airman was answered with a rifle butt. 3 more SAS men, wounded in the fighting that preceded the capture and taken to a civilian hospital, were later executed by lethal injection in their hospital beds. 7 French resistance fighters were killed in the same woods. 44 people total. Dead not because the SAS failed. Dead in substantial part because British and American headquarters staff had placed them in a position that experienced SAS officers had argued, loudly and repeatedly, they should never occupy. This is the story of what happens when men who know precisely what they are capable of are told by men who have never done it how to do their job. It is a story that runs from the burning airfields of Libya in 1941 through the forests of occupied France in 1944 to the western desert of Iraq in 1991. In each of those places, at each of those moments, British SAS veterans with combat experience measured in years rather than weeks found themselves in direct collision with the institutional preferences of a command structure that did not fully understand the weapon it was holding. Sometimes the argument was won quietly. Sometimes it was lost loudly. And sometimes, as in a wood near a village in southern France, the cost of losing it was paid in the most permanent currency there is. To understand the argument, you have to understand where it started and why it was, from the very beginning, a structural problem rather than a personality conflict. The Special Air Service began life in July 1941 from an unorthodox idea and plan by Lieutenant David Stirling of the Scots Guards. The idea was built around a specific and radical premise. Stirling argued for creating a force of around 200 men who could launch covert attacks against high-value targets such as ships and airfields, working in units of 4 or 5 men with the flexibility and stealth to achieve what larger forces couldn't. The argument was not complicated. It was the argument that small teams operating with total surprise could achieve results that large formations, by their very scale and visibility, could never replicate. No one in Middle East High Command wanted them to exist or succeed or do what they intended to do. The opposition was not tactical, it was cultural. British regimental tradition had no framework for what Stirling was proposing and no comfortable institutional category in which to place it. It was a harsh existence for Stirling and his men, but theirs was an unrestricted war far removed from the Cairo top brass and stifling military regulations. The early record spoke for itself. Something like 387 proven, probably more like 450 in reality. This small body of men who never numbered more than 600, moving in fast-moving jeeps, destroyed more warplanes on the ground than the entirety of the Royal Air Force. Erwin Rommel said of the SAS, "This one unit has caused me more harm and damage than any other unit of similar size within Allied forces." And it wasn't just harm and damage in terms of war material destroyed, it was actually much. More harm and damage to the morale of his troops, because if you can be attacked anywhere when you're asleep in your bed at night, hundreds of miles behind the front line, it's absolutely devastating for morale. But the record was not translating into institutional understanding at headquarters level. It was translating into something else, something more dangerous to the SAS than any German anti-aircraft battery. It was translating into interest. And interest, when it came from men who did not understand the unit's operational logic, reliably produced bad ideas about how to use it. The early successes were often interrupted by failure caused by the arrogance of higher headquarters staff who thought that they knew how best to make use of such specialists. The core of the argument was simple and never really changed across 4 years of war. The SAS operated on the assumption that small teams inserted deep required maximum autonomy to select their own targets, adapt their own routes, and make their own decisions in the field without reference to a timetable devised by people who were not there. Every time headquarters attempted to integrate the SAS into a broader conventional operation plan with fixed objectives, fixed timings, and fixed extraction windows, the result was predictably worse than what the unit achieved when left to its own methods. The men who had done it knew this. The staff officers who had not done it did not. These hit-and-run operations eventually proved Stirling's undoing. He was captured during one in Tunisia by the Germans in January 1943, having been dubbed the Phantom Major by Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. Although Stirling escaped from the Germans, he was subsequently recaptured by Italian forces. He made 4 further escape attempts before he was sent to Colditz Castle, where he remained as a prisoner for the rest of the war. Stirling's capture removed the unit's most effective advocate from the field at the worst possible moment. In January 1943, enemy forces captured Colonel Stirling in Tunisia, and Paddy Mayne replaced him as commander. A few months later, in April, they reorganized it into the Special Raiding Squadron and undertook raids in Sicily and Italy. The physical combat record of the unit under Mayne was, if anything, superior to anything achieved under Stirling. His bold combat style earned him 4 distinguished service orders. Mayne liked to lead from the front and personally destroyed more enemy aircraft on the ground than any other Allied soldier. But command was a different problem from combat. Mayne was, in the words of one assessment, a former Irish and Lions rugby international, fearsome in war and frightening in drink, who had to overcome his abhorrence of administration and contempt for staff officers to lead one SAS until the end of the war. The abhorrence and contempt were professionally justified. They were also institutionally costly, because the argument the SAS needed to win in 1944 was not fought with machine guns. It was fought with memoranda. The argument that mattered most in 1944 was about France. By early that year, the immediate question for SAS brigade planning was how the unit would be deployed in support of the Allied invasion of Normandy. In early 1944, the 1st and 2nd SAS regiments returned to the UK and joined a newly formed SAS brigade of the Army Air Corps. The other units in the brigade comprised 2 French SAS regiments, the 3rd and 4th, and 1 Belgian independent parachute company, the 5th. 5 regiments, 2 British, 2 French, 1 Belgian, a combined force with its own headquarters, its own chain of command, and for the first time in the unit's history, a formal relationship with the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force commanded by General Dwight D. Eisenhower and administered on a day-to-day basis by his deputy, the British Lieutenant General Frederick Browning. Browning was a formidable officer with an impressive record, commander of the 1st Airborne Division and a central figure in British airborne operations. He was also, on the specific question of how to use the SAS in France, comprehensively wrong. His view of the SAS brigade was as an airborne infantry formation that could be dropped just behind the forward edge of the battle area to support conventional operations and seize specific objectives in conjunction with the main assault. He wanted the SAS to function as a premium-grade parachute battalion, landing near the fight, doing a specific job, and being extracted or relieved within days. The man who commanded 2nd SAS Regiment and who had spent the preceding 2 years developing the practical theory of how a deep penetration raiding force actually worked was Bill Sterling. Bill was David's older brother, educated at Trinity College, Cambridge, commissioned into the Scots Guards, and in the professional assessment of most senior British Special Forces officers of the era, the more methodically rigorous military thinker of the two brothers. Contrary to later popular narratives, the idea for the Special Air Service was developed jointly by Bill and David Sterling. It was Bill who formally presented the concept to senior headquarters staff. Bill Sterling's position was clear, documented, and supported by everything the unit had learned since 1941. The SAS should not be dropped near the front line to function as conventional airborne infantry. It should be dropped deep, well behind German lines, to conduct the sustained disruption of communication and logistics infrastructure that the unit had been built to conduct. The approach marches would be longer, the insertions would be harder. The men would be isolated for weeks or months rather than days. But the effect on the German rear area would be cumulative and strategic rather than tactical and temporary. Sterling wanted his troops dropped far behind the front to continue their disrupting tactics, while Browning wanted the SAS to join other airborne troops landing just behind the front line and to act as standard parachute infantry. The disagreement was not a difference of opinion about tactics. It was a fundamental disagreement about what the SAS was for. And it was a disagreement that the man with 2 years of desert raiding behind his unit was losing to the man who was familiar with the concept of airborne assault, but had never watched it applied to the specific logic of deep special operations. On the 4th of June 1944, 2 days before D-Day, Sterling was removed as commanding officer of 2 SAS and replaced by Lieutenant Colonel Brian Franks. He had won the argument as to how best to use the SAS, but had been sacked in the process. Read that sentence again, slowly. He won the argument and was sacked for winning it. The institutional logic of a large headquarters in which seniority and command authority trumped operational expertise had produced the precise outcome that the SAS had been fighting since 1941. The man who was correct was removed. The principle he had been arguing for was adopted. The unit went to France under a new commanding officer to execute the strategy Bill Sterling had insisted upon and paid for with his career. There is a particular quality of bitterness in that outcome that has no comfortable name. It is not simply injustice, though it was that. It is the experience of being vindicated after being punished for being right, which is a different and stranger thing. The SAS Brigade went to France and conducted exactly the deep penetration operations that Bill Sterling had argued for and Browning had resisted. And across the summer of 1944, 2 things happened simultaneously. One of those operations became one of the most strategically effective Special Forces missions of the entire war. The other became one of the most catastrophic. Operation Houndsworth was a British Special Air Service operation during World War II. The operation, carried out by A Squadron 1st Special Air Service between the 6th of June and 6th of September 1944, was centered on Dijon in the Burgundy region of France. Operation Houndsworth consisted of 18 officers and 126 men of A Squadron 1st Special Air Service. They were dropped into the densely wooded highland of the Morvan, a remote massif southwest of Dijon in the Burgundy region, and they operated exactly as the SAS had always operated at its best. Deep, patient, self-sufficient, invisible to the enemy because they moved only when necessary and only where cover was absolute. The squadron proceeded with operations during which the Lyon to Paris rail lines were blown up 22 times. The railway network that ran through Burgundy toward Normandy was the primary ground logistics route for German forces attempting to reinforce the beach defenses. The SAS did not assault it directly. They stalked it, methodically cutting key sections, coordinating with French resistance groups who knew the terrain, then withdrawing back into the forest before the repair crews arrived. After one series of cuts, a member of the French resistance approached the workmen repairing the lines and asked how long the repairs would take. Becoming aware of his loyalties, they suggested that if the line had been cut further up, more damage could have been caused. The French workmen took the advice. The SAS had effectively extended their own operational reach without leaving the forest. Hounsworth had been extremely successful. 6 trains had been derailed, 22 railway lines cut, 70 vehicles destroyed, and about 3,000 members of the French resistance provided with arms. The operation inflicted over 220 German casualties, including killed and wounded, while capturing 132 prisoners. 3 months. 1 squadron. Deep in the French countryside, alone and unsupported, doing what the SAS had always done when given the latitude to do it properly. What happened to B Squadron in the same period was a different story entirely, and its roots lay not in operational failure, but in a sequence of decisions made above the level of the men on the ground. Operation Bull Basket was an operation by B Squadron, 1st Special Air Service, behind the German lines in German-occupied France between June and August 1944. The operation was located to the east of Poitiers in the Vienne department of southwest France. Its objective was to block the Paris to Bordeaux railway line near Poitiers and to hamper German reinforcements heading towards the Normandy beachheads, especially the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich. In May 1944, the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force had issued an order for the Special Air Service Brigade to carry out 2 operations in France: Hounsworth in the area of Dijon for a squadron, and Bull Basket near Poitiers, which was given to B Squadron. Schaeff's intelligence planning staff had produced an estimate for how long the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich would take to move from its rest area around Toulouse in southern France to the Normandy front. The intelligence experts at Schaeff, responsible for planning the Normandy landings, had estimated it would take 3 days for the Panzer Division to reach Normandy. The B Squadron team dropped into France on the 6th of June, 1944, literally hours before the first Allied boots hit the Normandy beaches. Once on the ground, the SAS squadron set about preventing German reinforcements reaching Normandy. They attacked the rail network, laid mines, conducted vehicle patrols in their jeeps, and trained members of the French resistance. The operation achieved real and immediate results. The SAS men discovered the whereabouts of a petrol supply train, which was destined for the 2nd SS Panzer Division. The supply train was destroyed by Royal Air Force bombers the same night. These actions, along with ambushes on rail and road transport, delayed the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich's arrival in Normandy until late June 1944, extending the timeline from an anticipated 3 days to over 3 weeks, and thereby aiding Allied efforts to contain the German counteroffensive around Caen. The 3-day estimate from Schaff Intelligence had been wrong. It took 3 weeks. The SAS had not just slowed the division. They had bought the Allied beachhead the time it needed to consolidate before the most dangerous armored formation in the German theater of operations could arrive, and then the location of the camp was betrayed. The German SS security police had been informed that the SAS camp was located in a forest near Verrières. On the 1st of July, they sent agents into the forest to attempt to locate the camp and assembled an attacking force based on the reserve battalion of the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division, Götz von Berlichingen, based at Bonneuil-Mature. The Germans, acting on information from a local informant, encircled and assaulted the new base in the Forêt de Verrières, southeast of Poitiers, on the 3rd of July, 1944. During this ambush, Lieutenant Tomo Stevens was beaten to death with a rifle butt at the scene while wounded. 7 French resistance fighters from the Maquis were executed immediately in the woods nearby, and 33 SAS personnel, along with 1 U.S. Army Air Forces pilot, Lieutenant Lincoln D. Bundy, were taken prisoner. On the 7th of July, 1944, the SAS prisoners were taken in lorries to the forest of Saint-Sauvant near the village of Rome. They were to be shot according to the infamous commando order, issued by Hitler, that all troops captured behind the lines on commando or parachute operations should be shot without trial, rather than treated as prisoners of war. The men were executed, and their bodies were buried in 3 mass graves that had already been dug. With them was the American pilot, Lieutenant Bundy, and pleas from the SAS men to spare him fell on deaf ears. 3 other SAS men who had been wounded in the fight and taken to hospital were executed by lethal injections while in their hospital beds. The bodies were not found immediately. It was not until after the German occupation was over that hunters discovered the mass graves. The bodies were exhumed, and autopsies revealed their violent death and the absence of identity tags removed by the Germans to try to cover up their crime. However, using personal items and dental records, it was clear that some could be positively identified as the Bullbasket Party, and the number of bodies matched the missing men. Captain John Tonkin, the officer commanding B Squadron, who survived because he had been away from the camp when the Germans struck, went on to call for the extraction of his remaining men and continued the operation until ordered to stand down on the 24th of July. Tonkin and the remainder of the SAS squadron, altogether 8 survivors of the attack and 3 others who had been away on a smaller operation at the time, escaped, regrouped, and carried on with the mission until the order to cease operations was received. The instinct to keep going, to complete the mission, and account for the men who hadn't come back by making the mission matter more, was a defining characteristic of the regiment. It was also, in this instance, an act of military commitment so controlled and deliberate that it bordered on the extraordinary. 8 men in hostile French countryside, with 30 of their comrades newly dead in mass graves they didn't yet know about, continuing to cut railway lines and mine roads for another 3 weeks. Not because anyone ordered them to, because it was what the SAS did. The lesson from Bullbasket was never comprehensively drawn by the institutional structures above the SAS. The commando order was the German instrument of death. But the degree to which the camp's location had been compromised, the degree to which the long-term static position of an SAS base conflicted with the operational security principles the unit had refined in North Africa, the degree to which the assignment to a relatively fixed area of operations ran against the SAS philosophy of constant movement and unpredictability. These were institutional failures. They were the consequence of placing a unit trained in fluid deep rating into a role that required it to hold ground and maintain a semi-permanent presence that any competent enemy intelligence network could eventually locate. Bill Sterling had been fired 2 days before this mission launched. The man who would have argued most forcefully for operational autonomy and doctrinal fidelity was already gone. His replacement, Lieutenant Colonel Brian Franks, was a competent officer who executed the operations he was given, including Hounsworth, with considerable skill. But the argument Sterling had been making was the argument about what the operations should be, not just how to conduct them once assigned. That argument had been lost before the planes left the runway. This pattern, experienced practitioners arguing against institutional misuse and being overruled, ignored, or removed, did not end with the Second World War. It resurfaced with remarkable structural similarity in every conflict the SAS subsequently entered, and nowhere with more geopolitical stakes than in the Gulf War of 1991. In August 1990, Saddam Hussein's Iraqi army crossed the border into Kuwait and occupied it within 12 hours. The international response was a coalition military buildup in Saudi Arabia of eventually more than 700,000 troops from 35 nations, commanded by American General Norman Schwarzkopf. When war loomed in the Gulf in late 1990 and early 1991, Britain committed a large number of forces, including the 22nd Special Air Service. Initially brought into the Gulf without a clear role, the SAS feared that the much-touted high-tech air war might mean a quiet war for them. Their traditional role of reconnaissance had largely been assigned to U.S. Special Forces. This was, in miniature, the same conversation the SAS had been having with command structures since 1941. The SAS were in the theater. There was a war. The Americans had already allocated the roles they thought mattered to their own forces. And Schwarzkopf, a man of enormous professional competence in conventional combined arms warfare, had a specific and skeptical view of Special Operations Forces that he made no great effort to conceal. Schwarzkopf was distrustful of Special Operations Forces, questioning what the SAS could do that an F-16 couldn't, and was equally concerned about diverting resources to rescue Special Operations Forces if something went wrong. This was a reasonable professional concern from a commander who had seen special operations misused in previous conflicts. It was also the precise attitude that had followed the SAS through its entire institutional history. The question of what a small team of skilled men could do that a conventional force element could not was a question that the SAS, by 1991, had been answering with results for exactly 50 years. It certainly helped that Schwarzkopf's second-in-command was British General Sir Peter de la Billière, who had served in and commanded the SAS and was Director of British Special Forces during the Iranian embassy siege in 1980. De la Billière understood not just the SAS's capabilities in abstract terms. He had commanded it. He had watched it work. He had the institutional memory of what happened when the unit was given latitude and what happened when it was constrained. De la Billière had been lobbying for the use of special forces behind Iraqi lines. Mindful of the regiment's beginnings in the deserts of Africa during World War II, he persuaded his U.S. counterpart Norman Schwarzkopf of the need for small fighting columns of SAS forces operating deep behind Iraqi lines, hitting targets of opportunity, and generally making a nuisance of themselves. The argument was not simply cultural, it was made concrete by a specific operational problem that conventional forces and high technology were conspicuously failing to solve. In retaliation for the pounding his forces were taking, Saddam Hussein responded with his only long-range weapon left in his arsenal, the Scud missile. The Soviet-designed missile was inaccurate and posed only a small threat to coalition forces. It was when Saddam started firing Scuds into Israel that the Allied commanders started to worry. Israel threatened to retaliate. If Israel entered the war against Iraq, the Arab nations within the coalition would face an impossible political position. The coalition itself might fracture. The fragile coalition of Arab countries allied with the U.S. would surely break apart if Israel was provoked into the war, and soon Schwarzkopf was getting anxious phone calls from his political masters. In an effort to find the Scuds, the U.S. Air Force flew hundreds of sorties into the western Iraqi desert. Despite their much-vaunted technology, the Air Force could not find a single Scud launcher. The Iraqis had adapted. The Iraqis were hiding the Scuds under bridges and in barns and transporting them inside school buses. Objects designed to be invisible at low altitude against desert terrain. Objects that moved constantly, set up, fired within minutes, and disappeared before the next satellite pass. The entire American technological architecture for battlefield surveillance, the investment of billions of dollars in satellite systems, reconnaissance aircraft, and electronic intelligence gathering, was being defeated by a truck covered in camouflage netting parked under a highway overpass. By mid-January 1991, the British commander decided the SAS could be effective in creating diversion ahead of the main attack, destroying Iraqi communications facilities, and tracking down mobile Scud missile launchers, which had so far evaded both air and satellite reconnaissance. The argument that de la Billière had been making to Schwarzkopf was now backed by the undeniable evidence of operational failure. The technology could not find the launchers. Human eyes could. The same principle that had made Bagnold's Desert Navigators and Sterling's Jeep columns effective in North Africa. The principle of small teams inserted quietly into ground that technology could not map with sufficient granularity was directly applicable to the problem of mobile Scud launchers in western Iraq. Small 8-man teams were to be flown into Iraq, where they would put in covert observation posts along the main supply routes in the hopes of catching a Scud convoy on the move. Once found, the SAS observation posts would call in coalition air power to take out the missile launchers. It was the same operational model as North Africa, right down to the pairing of the ground team's eyes with an external fire asset. In the desert of 1942, that had been Vickers K guns on jeeps. In 1991, it was a 10 Thunderbolts and laser-guided bombs. The principle was identical. Small team observes, identifies, coordinates strike. The technology changes. The concept does not. The SAS deployed about 300 members with A, B, and D squadrons, as well as 15 members from our squadron, the Territorial 22 SAS Squadron. This was the largest SAS mobilization since the Second World War. 3 squadrons plus supporting elements operating across the western Iraqi desert in fighting columns and observation post patrols simultaneously. The fighting columns were direct descendants of the jeep-mounted Vickers teams that had swept Sidi Hanish in 1942. The observation posts were direct descendants of the patient, motionless watching patrols that had developed across every theater the regiment had operated in since. One of the B Squadron Scud Watch teams was assigned the call sign Bravo 20. Bravo 20 was the call sign of an 8-man British Army SAS patrol deployed into Iraq during the First Gulf War in January 1991. According to one patrol member's account, the patrol was given the task of gathering intelligence, finding a good lying-up position, and setting up an observation post on the Iraqi main supply route between Baghdad and northwestern Iraq. While according to another, the task was to find and destroy Iraqi Scud missile launchers along a 250-kilometer stretch of the MSR. On the night of the 22nd and 23rd of January, the patrol were transported into Iraqi airspace by an RAF Chinook helicopter, along with Bravo 30 and their Land Rover 110 vehicles. Unlike Bravo 30, the patrol had decided not to take vehicles. That decision, the choice to go on foot rather than in vehicles, was one of several that would define the outcome. Soon after the patrol landed on Iraqi soil, Lane discovered that they had communication problems and could not receive messages on the patrol's radio. McNabb later claimed that the patrol had been issued incorrect radio frequencies. However, a 2002 BBC report discovered that there was no error with the frequencies because the patrol's transmissions had been noted in the SAS daily record log. Ratcliffe lays the blame for the faulty radios on McNabb as the patrol commander. It was his job to make sure the patrol's equipment was working. Compromised by a shepherd boy on the 24th of January, the patrol was forced to attempt an escape and evasion towards the Syrian border in deteriorating winter conditions. After an adventurous few days, 4 SAS troopers fell into Iraqi hands. 3 were killed, 2 by hypothermia, 1 by enemy fire, and 1 successfully escaped to Syria. The Bravo 20 patrol's fate has been analyzed, disputed, and written about extensively in multiple competing accounts by surviving patrol members, each with different versions of specific events. What is not in dispute is the broader operational context. Despite dangerous terrain, dreadful weather, intelligence mistakes, and radio problems, the regiment lost only 4 soldiers. In recognition of its service, the regiment received 55 medals for gallantry and meritorious service. General Schwarzkopf thanked the SAS with his personal commendation for their work. U.S. and British special operators reduced Scud launches against Israel by more than 80%. The political objective, keeping Israel out of the war and the coalition intact, was achieved. The technical mechanism for achieving it, small teams on foot and in vehicles, watching roads that satellites could not monitor with sufficient persistence, was the mechanism that de la Billière had argued for against Schwarzkopf's initial skepticism, and that the SAS had been demonstrating since 1941. Schwarzkopf's final assessment of the SAS contribution was a personal commendation. It was a remarkable reversal from the man who had questioned what a small team could do that an F-16 couldn't. The answer, 50 years and 3 wars after Stirling had first articulated it, was the same answer it had always been. They could go where the aircraft couldn't see. They could wait where the satellite couldn't loiter. They could tell the difference between a fuel tanker and a school bus. And they could do it without anyone at a headquarters being able to explain exactly how. The structural argument, the argument about who got to decide how to use the SAS, has never been entirely resolved because it cannot be resolved. It is inherent to the relationship between a specialist deep rating force and the conventional command structures above it. The specialist unit develops expertise that the command structure cannot evaluate from outside. The command structure has legitimate authority over deployment and operational parameters. The tension between those two realities is permanent. What the record from 1941 to 1991 demonstrates is what happens at each end of the range of responses to that tension. When the SAS was given latitude, the results were consistent and extraordinary. The Desert Airfield Raids, Operation Houndsworth, the Gulf War fighting columns, 350 aircraft, 22 railway lines, 80% reduction in Scud launches. Every one of those outcomes was achieved by small groups of men operating with maximum autonomy, minimum footprint, and the specific institutional knowledge of 50 years about how to operate in denied terrain against an enemy who did not know they were coming. When the latitude was reduced, when the SAS was assigned to fixed objectives by headquarters planners who did not understand the operational logic of the unit, the results were different. Operation Bulbasket was not a failure of courage. B Squadron's men were among the finest soldiers Britain produced during the Second World War, veterans of multiple airfield raids, desert navigations, and combat actions across 2 continents. They were destroyed not by German tactical superiority, but by a combination of factors that Bill Stirling could have predicted from his desk in London. Too long in one place, too visible a presence, too much integration into a fixed chef operational framework that required them to maintain a semi-permanent position that an informant could locate and a Panzer Grenadier battalion could surround. Bill Stirling was right. He was fired. 34 of his regiment's soldiers were executed in a French wood. The causal chain connecting those 3 facts is not simple and should not be overstated because the commando order was Hitler's instrument and German hands pulled the triggers. But the question of whether those men should have been in that wood, in that fixed position, for that long, under that operational framework, is a question that the SAS had been arguing against since the day someone at headquarters first decided they knew better how to use the unit than the unit knew how to use itself. The story takes them through early success and failure, often caused by the arrogance of higher headquarters staff who thought that they knew how best to make use of such specialists. That sentence was written about the first 2 years of the regiment's existence. It could have been written about any of them. The men who built the SAS understood something about institutional expertise that has never fitted comfortably into the hierarchical structures of conventional military command. Expertise acquired under fire in specific operational environments is not transferable by briefing. A staff officer who reads the after-action reports of 100 desert raids does not thereby acquire the judgment of the man who conducted them. The reports describe what happened. They do not transmit the texture of the knowledge that produced the decision to act at exactly that moment, from exactly that angle, with exactly that combination of speed and silence and violence that made the difference between 30 aircraft destroyed and 1 man killed versus the reverse. David Sterling had known this when he limped into Middle East headquarters on crutches in 1941 and demanded the authority to prove his concept. Sterling worked tirelessly to overcome the opposition from the military bureaucracy of Middle East HQ and provide the material and administrative support that the new unit required. The opposition was not purely obstructive. Much of it came from officers who were trying to fit a genuinely novel concept into frameworks they understood, which is a reasonable institutional reflex. It simply happened to be the wrong reflex when applied to this unit. And the damage it caused was measured not in failed careers, though it caused those too, but in men who did not come home. By the end of the Second World War on the 8th of May, 1945, the SAS had suffered 330 casualties, but had killed or wounded 7,733 and captured 23,000 of their enemies. Those numbers exist in a specific ratio: the killed and wounded on one side, the casualties on the other. The ratio is not the product of luck or superior equipment. It is the product of the specific operational methodology that the unit developed from first principles in the North African desert, defended at every level of command against the instinct of larger institutional structures to absorb, redirect, and conventionalize the thing that made it effective. The argument was never about whether the SAS should operate under command. Of course it should. Every military unit in a coalition operates under command because coordination and mutual support require it. The argument was about who understood the unit well enough to give it orders that did not destroy what it was. David Sterling had that understanding and was captured in Tunisia. Following Sterling's capture, Paddy Mayne took command of the SAS. Mayne had it in excess and expressed it through a comprehensive personal contempt for the staff officer class that occasionally made the argument harder to win. Bill Sterling had it, argued it with precision, and was removed 2 days before D-Day. Peter de la Billière had it, argued it with diplomatic skill, and persuaded Schwarzkopf in time to matter. The difference in outcomes at the political and institutional level bore no direct relationship to who was right on the operational question. All three men were right. Mayne destroyed more aircraft than any other Allied serviceman in history and did not receive the Victoria Cross he was recommended for, while Sterling, whose ideas Mayne had translated into results, received a Distinguished Service Order. Bill Sterling won the argument about how to use the SAS in France and was fired for winning it. De la Billière prevailed, and the Gulf War ended with a personal commendation from the man who had questioned the SAS's worth. Across 50 years and 3 theaters, the regiment had been making the same argument. They were veterans. They knew the terrain. They knew the enemy. They knew what the unit could do and what trying to make it do something else would cost. The question of whether their superiors were willing to listen, whether the institutional structure above them had the flexibility to hear expertise delivered from below the level of command rather than above it, had nothing to do with tactics. It had everything to do with whether men lived or died. The SAS had played a small but significant role in the successful invasion of France in 1944, earning praise from Allied Supreme Commander General Eisenhower for their guerrilla campaign against the Nazis. The praise came after. The argument had been fought before, and the distance between those two facts, between the argument that had to be made and the praise that was offered once the argument was proved in blood, is the distance that the regiment has been crossing ever since the day a young Scots Guards officer on crutches dragged himself through a gap in a wire fence to tell a general in Cairo that he was thinking about special operations entirely wrong. He was right. The general came around, and the world's most effective special operations force spent the rest of the 20th century repeating that exchange in every theater it entered, with every command structure that inherited it, because the knowledge of what the SAS was and what it required existed inside the regiment and had to be fought for again and again, from the desert airfields of Libya to the forests of Burgundy to the flat featureless plains of western Iraq. It is still being fought for. It always will be. Because the institutional instinct to conventionalize the unconventional, to assign specific tasks to units built for maximum flexibility, and to mistake operational excellence for subordination is not a failure of specific individuals. It is a structural property of large organizations, and the SAS has been correcting it, at cost, for as long as it has existed. The men in the forest of Saint-Sauvant deserved better than the decisions that put them there. The men of Bravo 20 deserved better than the communications planning that left them silent in the desert. Every SAS soldier who has ever been ordered into a mission shaped by people who did not understand what they were deploying deserved better. The answer to that debt is not retrospective anger. It is the ongoing argument, fought in planning rooms and command conferences and operational briefings, by the people who have been there, for the right to do what they know how to do, the way they know how to do it, on their own terms. Who dares wins. The other half of that equation, the half that never made it onto the badge, is this: who listens wins faster.